Stephen Bedard here. I thought I would try something a bit different. I thought it might be a great idea to go through a book of the Bible and just spend a number of videos going through, digging into what the scriptures say. And I thought, what would be the easiest book of the Bible for us to start off with? And of course, it's the book of Revelation. I mean, how much simpler can you get than the book of Revelation? So what I'm going to do is spend one video per chapter, and I'm going to begin with just an introduction to the book of Revelation. And the first lesson for you is that it is the book of Revelation, not the book of Revelations, okay? Next time you say book of Revelations, just give yourself a little bit of a shake and say, no, it is the book of Revelation. Now, that title, Revelation, the Greek for that is apocalypse. Now, when we think of apocalypse, we think of the end of the world, of the destruction of life as we know it. So there's a whole genre of television shows and movies that are called post-apocalyptic. I love The Walking Dead. It's a great TV show that takes place after the apocalypse, which is the whatever virus that caused people to become the walkers that we find in that TV show. But that's not what apocalypse means. Apocalypse means revelation. Of course, in the book of Revelation, we see talk of the end of this world as we know it, but that is not what the word itself means. It means revelation. So actually, when you talk about post-apocalyptic, technically you're saying post-revelation is what you're saying. But of course, that doesn't really help us when we're into science fiction and love that kind of genre of TV show and movie. But it's important for you to know that the book of Revelation is the book of the apocalypse, and that's really important. So who wrote Revelation? Well, we find out that it's by John of Patmos. He is the one who receives this revelation. But who is John? Well, church tradition has connected him with John, the author of the Gospel and of the letters. However, there's nothing in the book that says that specifically that he is that John. Is he that John? Is he not? Who knows? And I'm not sure that it really matters. Probably there are some people who think for Revelation to be worth studying, for Revelation to be worth being in the scriptures, it has to be John, the son of Zebedee. However, we don't know that for sure, so we're just going to say that it's written by John, and who this John was and what else he did is really not essential to the message of Revelation. So the book of Revelation belongs to a specific genre, and this is important because anytime we're studying something else in the Bible, we would look to what its genre is. So if we are reading a historical book, we want to know what is the genre of ancient history like. If we are reading one of the Gospels that belong to the ancient bios or ancient biography, we would want to know what kind of genre that is, and we would interpret it in that context. The same with Paul's epistles. What does an ancient epistle look like? Then that helps us to understand what we are looking at when it comes to Paul's letters. So, what is the genre of Revelation? The genre of Revelation is, are you ready for it? It's apocalyptic, okay? Actually, I think the genre is actually named after Revelation, but it has been around for a long time before then. It was a Jewish genre of writing, and there are a number of earlier apocalypses that we find in Jewish writings. So of course, we can look back to Daniel. Daniel has apocalyptic sections in it, and Zechariah has some apocalyptic sections, but those aren't fully apocalyptic writings. They have apocalypses within them, but that's not all that is there. So what is an apocalypse? Well, one of the standard definitions comes from this book here by John J. Collins, The Apocalyptic Imagination, which really is focusing on Jewish apocalyptic literature. And his definition is really accepted by a lot of scholars. And I think it's going to be helpful for us to start our conversation. So this is how he defines an apocalypse: a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal insofar as it is envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. And that seems to fit pretty good for the book of Revelation, and it's helpful for us to do that. So we need to be reading it as an apocalypse. If we tried to read Revelation as history, if we try to read it in terms of any other genre, we're going to get ourselves in trouble. We have to read it as an apocalypse. And why this is important is that there is already standard phrases, images, and symbols within apocalyptic literature, and we need to interpret Revelation in that context, because the people who were first reading Revelation, they were aware that these other apocalypses were around, of First Enoch and Second Baruch and others like that. They were aware of these things, and so they would interpret it in that way. Just as if we watch a science fiction movie, we are aware of the genre of science fiction, so we don't see that as a prediction of how things are going to be. It's more an escapist kind of genre because we're familiar with that genre, and that's how we watch those movies. And it's the same thing for the ancients when they would read the book of Revelation. So speaking of the people who first read this book, what is the purpose of the book of Revelation? Why was it given to us? There was a church that I used to be a part of that really loved the book of Revelation. And I talk about this in my video on where I've come in terms of my understanding of the end times and all of that. But they really seem to see the book of Revelation as being fairly meaningless to the majority of church history. Most Christians throughout the last 2,000 years, Revelation hasn't been very helpful for them because the end times hasn't happened. But we live in the end times. Jesus is about to come back any time now. And so Revelation is written directly for us, which at the time would have been late 20th century Western Christendom. That's who Revelation was written for. I am not convinced of that. In fact, I think that Revelation really only makes sense if we understand it in the way that the original readers would have understood that. Because if it's not meaningful for the original audience, I don't see how that it's meaningful for us. If we take Revelation as a source of hints about the end times, of secret codes that will tell us who the Antichrist is and when Jesus is coming back and all of those things, then we get into the mistakes that give us books like 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1988, which, by the way, you can still get that book in Amazon. If you look for it, you're going to find a used copy of that. Probably it's not going to be very helpful for you, but I just wanted to let you know that it's there. We don't want to get into that kind of mistake. That's not what Revelation was written for. It wasn't written for the audience that was going to be there just as Jesus comes back so that they can understand the details and make the predictions and figure out what is going on. It is written for the people who originally received it and were actually given those recipients. It's the 7 churches of Revelation, which are found in Asia Minor, and we're going to talk about that when we get to that chapter. But it was written for them, and it had to be meaningful to them. And how was it meaningful? They were Christians who were living during a time of testing, during a time of persecution, where things were hard. And they are being encouraged to stand strong in their faith by being reminded of the big story of what God is doing in the world, in creation, how he is going to ultimately conquer evil, and that Jesus is going to come back. There's going to be a resurrection, and God's kingdom would be here in its fullness. That is what Revelation is about. And that's a message that is meaningful in every century, whether it is the first century or the 21st century. Those are the things that are important for us to be aware of. Speaking of, you might wonder, when was Revelation written? It's likely that it was written during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, which was at the end of the first century. Now, there are some Christians that would prefer a date during Emperor Nero, but I don't think that that's very convincing. Although Nero is mentioned in Revelation, it is more likely that it is during the time of Domitian. I realize that there are some people who think if we can date the books of the Bible as early as possible, that somehow makes them more valuable, more dependable. But I think Revelation makes a lot of sense for us if it was written during the time of Domitian. So we need to be aware of all of that context. And we're going to go through this book, and we're going to understand a little bit about the structure of it. And as I mentioned, that there are letters to 7 churches. These are actually epistles, and they're in that genre of epistles. So that is included in this apocalypse. And we need to take that into account. I know there was a time in my life, especially my early 20s, where I'd look at Revelation. I was really interested in the end times kind of stuff, and I would just blast through the letters to the 7 churches, because who really cares about what happens there? That's none of my business. What I want to know about are the details, how Jesus is going to come back, what's the end times going to look like, can I recognize it in the newspapers of the day? That's what I was interested in. But those 7 letters are very important, so we're going to spend some time in that. And then we have to figure out what happens afterwards. And there are some people who think that what is being described in Revelation is in chronological order, that it starts with what happened with those 7 churches, and then it begins with the beginnings of the end times, and it is one event after another leading right up to the return of Jesus and the millennium and all of the other things that happened there. However, as we're going to see, there are some problems with that view, because it seems like when you look at the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, which are the 3 major sections that are found within Revelation, that they overlap. They don't seem to be happening that you have those events one after another. Rather, it's almost like we have the discussion of the seals, and then we're going back to the beginning of that, and we're going to tell that same story this time according to the trumpets, and then we go back to that, and we're going to start it again with the bowls. That seems to be what happens. At least that's what I'm convinced of as I've read that. If you've not encountered that way of looking at Revelation, well, join us for the journey, and we will see how things go. So I think that's about all that I need to say for this first video. I do want to recommend a book, though, and the book I'm going to recommend is Craig Keener's commentary on Revelation from the NIV Application Commentary series. And I actually quite like this series. Craig Keener is a great scholar, but this series in general, and this commentary in particular, is not so scholarly that the average person can't understand it. It is very practical, so it will have all the background stuff that we need. It is not theology light, it's not Bible light. It has all the stuff that we need, but it has some application as well. And so I find it very helpful. This is actually the textbook I used when I taught Revelation at Tyndale University a number of years ago, and I was very happy with it. I was glad that I had picked this as the textbook. So if you're interested, you can pick up a copy of this and follow along in the weeks to come as we go through Revelation. Thank you for watching this. Make sure to check out my website at stephenjbedard.com, and God bless you.